All right. So in the remainder of this first chapter, Dewey is going to briefly draw out some implications of his position. So I'll look at the first two or so, well, probably just the first two in this particular video. So first implication, he says logic is a progressive discipline. So it progresses, it has, it's not a static once and for all thing. It changes, it progresses, it becomes hopefully better. The reason for this, he goes on, the reason for this is that logic rests upon analysis of the best methods of inquiry, being judged best by their results with respect to continued inquiry that exist at a given time. That's kind of a long sentence with an interruption in it, but logic is based upon analyzing the best methods we have of inquiry at any particular time. And best is being judged by the consequences for continued inquiry. So going on, as the methods of the sciences improve, corresponding changes take place in logic. Right? So improvement in science leads to changes in logic. Since logic derives from practice, including scientific practice, changes in practice in the methods of science change logical form. An enormous change has taken place in logical theory since the classic logic formulated the methods of the science that existed in its period. So it has occurred. It has occurred in consequence of the development of mathematical and physical science. If, however, present theory provided a coherent formulation of existing scientific methods, freed from a doctrine of logical forms inherited from a science that is no longer held, this treatise would have no reason for existence. So he's saying that it would seem there's a lag, right? A kind of a lag between logical theory and scientific method. Scientific method might advance more quickly, but it takes a while for logic to catch up. And so if logic perfectly matched the development of science, then Dewey would not have any reason to write this book, but he's trying to bring logic up to date with the best methods that we have now, rather than still having a logic that derives from older methods. When in the future methods of inquiry are further changed, so when in the future methods of inquiry are further changed, logical theory will also change, or at least it should change. There is no ground, he writes, there is no ground for supposing that logic has been or ever will be so perfected that, save perhaps for minor details, it will require no further modification. The idea that logic is capable of final formulation is an eidolon of the theater. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but an eidolon or eidolon is like a ghost or a spirit. So he means something like something we imagine, but that could never actually exist. So a fancy way of saying that, right? So there's no ground for supposing that logic will ever be perfected such that it will not require any further modification. So he's against this, against the idea that logic exists in a once and for all perfect form out kind of somewhere on some plane of the universe, and we just have to figure out what it is, and then we'll have a perfect logic. Logic is tied into human life. It's tied into our processes of inquiry as represented most rigorously by scientific inquiry. So let's go on to the second implication. He writes, the subject matter of logic is determined operationally. And here he has a footnote, and so far I've been kind of ignoring the footnotes. Mostly they're pointing out his debts to people, especially Charles Sanders Peirce, but maybe we should look at this footnote 5, which is about operational. let's try to take a look at that. It's a little bit confusing, the relation among these terms, operational and instrumental, but he tries to clarify that a little in this footnote. So footnote 5, he writes that the word operational is not a substitute for what is designated by the word instrumental. So these are different things, operational and instrumental. It, operational, expresses the way in and by which the subject matter of inquiry is rendered the means to the end of inquiry. So the way in and by which the subject matter of inquiry, so what we are inquiring about, what this subject matter is, how that is rendered the means to the end of inquiry, the institution of determinate existential situations. So the end of inquiry, the goal of inquiry is the creation of a new existential situation, an improved existential situation. And the way we do that is by operating on the subject matter. So it could be some kind of problem or a scientific object or something. And we have to operate upon that in order to reach the conclusion of inquiry, in order to have a successful inquiry. But then, so as a general term, instrumental stands for the relation of means consequence. So means and consequence as the basic category for interpretation of logical forms, while operational stands for the conditions by which subject matter is rendered fit to serve as means, and 2, actually functions as such means in affecting the objective transformation, which is the end of inquiry. So instrumental here has something to do with logic of relating means and ends, which we've seen him discuss already at many points in this first chapter. So how do we choose the right means to get to the ends that we desire? So instrumental has something to do with that, which would be related to logical forms, right? Instrumental stands for the relation of means consequence as the basic category for interpretation of logical forms. So interpreting the logical forms as having to do with the means consequence relationship, whereas operational has to do with more with the methods of inquiry. So how we take a subject matter, something we want to understand, how we make that able to serve as means to the end of inquiry that we want, and how it, he says, how it actually functions as such means in helping us to change the situation, the problematic situation. Right, so operational and instrumental, these terms will be used throughout, so we'll see them in many different contexts. But it seems in general, operational has to do with the methods of inquiry, how we're modifying the world in order to, figure out what's going on, whereas instrumental has to do with the logical forms that we use to decide how to do this. So let's go back to this second implication. So the second implication was that the subject matter of logic is determined operationally. So he'll explain this. This thesis is a verbal restatement of what was said earlier. The methods of inquiry are operations performed or to be performed. Right? So operational has to do with methods of inquiry. Methods of inquiry are operations which you perform on subject matters, on the world, on stuff. Continuing, logical forms are the conditions that inquiry, qua inquiry, has to meet. So that, again, has to do with the instrumental aspect. So we have to try to conform our inquiry to the best logical forms available. And then operations, he writes, operations, to anticipate, fall into 2 general types. So 2 general types. There are operations that are performed upon and with existential material as an experimental observation. And when he's talking about existential material, this is stuff that really exists in the world, things that exist. So when we're doing experiments and observing the outcomes of experiments, we're dealing with existential material. So that's one type of operation. But then there are operations performed with and upon symbols. So operations performed with and upon symbols. So that's, he's distinguishing here symbols from existential materials. But even in the latter case, operation is to be taken in as literal a sense as possible. There are operations like hunting for a lost coin or measuring land, and there are operations like drawing up a balance sheet. So land or coins being material existences, a balance sheet being a sheet of symbols that refer to other things. So the former, so land, measuring land, hunting for a lost coin, these things, the former, are performed upon existential conditions, real world situations. The latter upon symbols, so drawing up a balance sheet, that's manipulating symbols. But the symbols in the latter case stand for possible final existential conditions, while the conclusion, when it is stated in symbols, is a precondition of further operations that deal with existences. Right, so that's a little bit of a one more complicated sentence that we find. So the symbols are possible final existential conditions. So symbols, as we use them, they should cash out somehow in existence. So they're possible. So we could end up finding them in the real world, or we could not. But they need to have that possibility there of being relatable to existential conditions. And then the conclusion of the symbolic manipulation of operating upon symbols is a precondition for further operations that deal with existences. Yeah, so it gives us a basis for new operations, for new activities on existing things. Moreover, down at the bottom here, moreover, the operations involved in making a balance sheet for a bank or any other business involve physical activities. The so-called mental element in operations of both these kinds has to be defined in terms of existential conditions and consequences, not vice versa. I'm gonna maybe ignore that last sentence. There's a lot in there which will need to be explained, and it will come up again later in other parts of the book. So what the status of the term mental is a whole discussion, which we'll get to in the appropriate place. It would be a lot to try to get into right now. So just put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it eventually. So finishing up this second implication, last couple of paragraphs on that. He writes, operations involve both material and instrumentalities. So material things and techniques. So both material and instrumentalities, including in the latter tools and techniques. So tools and techniques are the instruments that we use to manipulate material. The more material and instrumentalities are shaped in advance with a view to their operating in conjunction with each other as means to consequences, the better the operations performed are controlled. So the more we prepare our material and the tools and techniques that we're going to use, things will work out better, probably. At least they're likely to work out better. Operations will go more smoothly. The inquiry will be better controlled. Refined steel, which is the matter of the operations by which a watch spring is formed, is itself the product of a number of preparatory operations executed with reference to getting the material into the state that fits it to be the material of the final operation. Yeah, so to make a watch, you need to prepare the materials. If you don't prepare the materials in the right way, you're not going to end up with a good watch. The material is thus as instrumental, right? Having the right materials, the well-refined, nicely crafted materials that go into the final thing. But so this is material. So that material is instrumental, right? The material is thus as instrumental from an operational point of view as are the tools and techniques by which it is brought into a required condition. So both things, material and tools and techniques, are instrumental. They have their use, they're necessary to go into the, to reach the desired conclusion. On the other hand, you move this screen here. So on the other hand, old tools and techniques are modified in order that they may apply more effectively to new materials. So you also change the tools and techniques. The introduction, for example, of the lighter metals demanded different methods of treatment from those to which the heavier metals previously used were subjected, or, stated from the other side, the development of electrolytic operations made possible the use of new materials as means to new consequences. Yeah, so new materials allow new consequences, require new techniques make new materials possible, and so on and so on. So everything, it kind of ties back into that idea of progressiveness that he mentioned in the first point. So last paragraph here. The illustration is drawn from the operations of industrial arts, but the principle holds of operations of inquiry. The latter also proceed by shaping, on one hand, subject matter, so that it lends itself to the application of conceptions as modes of operation, and, on the other hand, by development of such conceptual structures as are applicable to existential conditions. So another complicated sentence, but basically in inquiry as well, we're modifying the subject matter so that it can be used according to our best modes of operation. And we're also developing good conceptual structures, good logical forms for that can best apply to conditions as we find them, to existential conditions. So there's, again, this back and forth between developing materials and developing conceptual structures. Since, as in the arts, both movements take place in strict correspondence with each other, the conceptions employed are to be understood as directly operational, while the existential material, in the degree in which the conditions of inquiry are satisfied, is determined both by operations and with an eye to operations still to be executed. So again, materials and techniques are related to each other. Methods of inquiry are related to each other. The conceptions employed are operational, so concepts are operational. They guide our operation on materials. The existential material is determined by operations as well at the end here. So he says the existential materials that we're working on. So kinds of matter, subject matter, anything that we're investigating. So the existential material is determined by the operations that we bring to it. So maybe by the theory you could think about. Theory helps determine the subject matter of our inquiry. And it's also determined by what operations we intend to do on it, the operation still to be executed. So operations kind of help form that material. kind of in a more immediate sense, right? When working with something, we're forming it into something we can work with, but we're also intending to work on it on an ongoing basis, so with an eye to operations still to be executed. All right, so these were the first two implications, which were logic is a progressive discipline, right? It changes, it's not something static. And the second one, the subject matter of logic is determined operationally. So the existences that we're dealing with, the things we're working with, the subject matter of our inquiry, that logical form is applied to. This is determined through the operation of logic, through conceptual structures and so forth. All right, and I'll continue with the rest of the implications next time in the next video.